Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with the Game Week 6 cheat sheet. And this week we don't have too many changes for the midfielders. I feel like what's actually happened is because the games are only closing in to Game Week 9 and simply because the fixtures aren't very good for some of the teams outside of the top 6, we are seeing a kind of close off, I would say, of some assets and their opportunities. And that's exactly what we see with someone like De Silva. De Silva is someone who hasn't played and started in the previous match, and he simply completely dropped as an asset from that basically lightning start. And Brentford's run are also going to get a little bit tougher in the future. And simply because Pereira is such a great option starting from Game Week 8, there really is no reason to even consider any other option in the game. You could maybe go into someone like Lavia or simply just go for another 4.5 playing mid or a 4.4 so you can actually save yourself money. And I think that actually is going to be the play going forwards. As far as the 5.0 to 5.9 midfielders, Eze has closed off his window, I would say, as well, because the next few fixtures are tough. It's Newcastle, it's Man United, and even Brighton and Chelsea. These are all white fixtures that I've classified now, mostly because we know Palace do play quite well at home, and I think they've been matching up with a lot of these top teams well. But in terms of how interesting Eze can be as an asset, I feel like his ceiling potentially is a little bit lower than we would expect. I know he's a lovely player to watch. He's very technical, very creative, but I do think this Crystal Palace team are playing a little bit too defensive, especially when they actually gain a lead. And that was something actually Zaha complained in his post-match press conference when he was sort of explaining why he was so upset with the result. There is a tendency, I suppose, for this Crystal Palace team to actually drop off and actually sit a little bit deeper, and that also affects how we evaluate someone like Eze, right? In a team that potentially isn't as creative overall and aggressive as we'd like. And Aronson, on the other hand, I feel like is slightly different because we know this Leeds team is a little bit more chaotic and they do go for more chances, and the expected goals do actually support that too. Crystal Palace is a team that are downtrading on defense, whereas Leeds are a team that, in terms of expected goals, is actually ranking very high in top half in the league. So I do like the perspective of enjoying from someone like Aronson. His assist to Sinistero was a little bit of a fluke, to be honest. I mean, it was just once again a great outside the box goal from Sinistero. So effectively 2 from 2 in terms of his last 2 starts for the team. And I just don't really see the value of Aronson being as high as it possibly could when you compare it to someone like Gross, who's still at the top. When we're talking about Neto and Gray and Gordon, these are players who fall because, I mean, just simply look at those fixtures. Having Liverpool, Arsenal, and City mixed among there just basically suggests that we're not going to get really anything. And Wolves are already a team that struggled to create effective chances versus top defenses. We know it's only going to get worse. We've seen Neto score, of course, versus big teams, but are you really going to chance it when they can't even score versus Bournemouth? I feel like that's sort of the situation we're finding ourselves in, and it's really just time to go simply with Wolves assets. With Everton, Liverpool, and Arsenal just front loaded, that's super tough. And yeah, no reason to actually keep Gray and Gordon if you've had them. If you've enjoyed someone like Gordon's hauls, I think it is time to sell it. It is good to actually maybe look at a Brighton or Leeds asset for a few weeks and then reconsider if Gordon is still in the club and still doing well. As far as the 6.0 to 6.9 options, I did mention last week that there was a bit of a debate. And seeing from the comments, I do understand a lot of people really enjoy Odegaard, but I do still think Martinelli is the absolute gem piece here, and that's exactly why he's at the top of the list. There's nothing wrong with Odegaard as an option. I've discussed it in chat. I do love him as a player. He came from Real Madrid, and obviously had some great loans in the Eredivisie, and has been an exceptional talent and has only grown under Arteta. I feel like he's getting a lot more shots, but Martinelli for me is the more interesting asset in open play, and I do think that's something I can bank on more. It's something I feel like gets more consistency, and that's why for me Martinelli is someone who also shows up quite a bit in terms of racking bonus. He is just the more interesting asset in open play. I think Odegaard is a little bit more expensive in comparison, and as I said, I don't really like the idea of tripling up on Arsenal attack, and that's exactly why Odegaard is tier 2. On another situation, if Martinelli was potentially priced as a 7, then maybe we could reconsider. Talking about Harrison and Sinistero, though, these are the 2 assets that people would be most interested in around the 6.0 territory for Leeds. Sinistero is, of course, a 6.5, and I can understand a lot of people wanting to move into Sinistero because he is someone who we've seen has been able to play both from cutting inside on the left and being able to score from the right versus Everton. And that's really handy because both Jack Harrison and him can rotate flanks, and they're probably going to start most games, especially with Dan James potentially going to Fulham, as far as I'm aware with the transfer news. And Sinistera is someone who we know has been eased in slowly. He played 63 minutes versus Everton, and I think that's my only concern with him as an asset. Otherwise, I might actually have considered putting him as a green just for the short term. What I don't like about Leeds too is because that game has come and gone versus Everton, you do have a game week 8 game versus United coming up very, very quickly. And specifically for the people considering a wild card, that has somewhat closed the window on Leeds assets. Yes, there's a great Nottingham Forest fixture in the future, but we know it's also Nottingham Forest potentially is a ticking time bomb in the opposite direction, where they could be a team that continues to build some confidence, especially with the new transfers, and finds at least some footing with the 20 players that they brought into the club this season. As far as Trossard, I haven't actually moved him towards a top option. I think that's just to respect how interesting Martinelli as a pick, and also just to reflect that Gross is someone who is a little bit better priced, arguably based on his current performances this season. And as someone who actually has brought in Trossard myself into his team, I'm a little bit hoping that I can take from what Trossard has provided at the back half of last season and can find some form and some specific footing, given that Estupiñán is now playing left wing back, which does push him forwards. Arguably, some people might even question that and say that he played his best football at left wing back. And I think for me, it's a wait and see, but I do think he's a punt. I do think Gross is the more interesting option because it does free up money in your team, and that's why Trossard still remains as a tier 2 option. I didn't really move Rashford because he didn't move the needle too much for me in the Leicester game. I do think Leicester are a very, very poor team, and I still don't like how this team plays without Martial. I think Martial is a key piece, and he's a much better centre forward than Rashford in terms of hold-up play. Rashford does make some good touches here and there, but I don't think he's consistent enough. He always will make maybe the first touch and the second touch right, but the third touch and the fourth touch will be a little bit more lacking. And when it's one-touch football, when he gets to lay the ball off to Sancho easily, it's nicer. But with Arsenal next and then Crystal Palace, which is actually a very tough game away, I'm not that interested in Rashford, to be honest. Say Maximum still seems seemingly injured at the time of this recording, so we'll have to see what happens there. If he wasn't injured, I actually probably would actually rise him towards the top option this week because he looks that good. And Guedes, for the same reason why Neto has fallen, has dropped, and Rodrigo simply, unfortunately, is in a void because it seems like his timeline is at least 4 weeks because we'll have an international break and around game week 8, and that's probably when he'll return. So he's in a void for now. Moving into the second half of the midfielders, I feel like what's the issue with the 7.0 to 7.8 price range is simply you are kind of picking between Bernardo and Gundogan, and I feel like both these players aren't playing the most attacking roles that we would have expected from them, especially from years past. Specifically in the case of Gundogan, watching him in the Nottingham Forest game, I don't think he really made any kind of attacking runs whatsoever. He was actually playing pretty much as a classic sort of centre mid who was holding alongside Rodri and wasn't really involved outside of the box and or even anywhere near where he could have provided some goal scoring opportunities for himself. Bernardo was someone who did dribble around the edge of the box, was kind of playing another sort of right centre mid, right wing position, but didn't look that involved as well. I think the main thing with Bernardo is because he does like to carry the ball quite a bit. A lot of the goals right now that City are scoring are simply through one-touch football with Haaland. So someone like Foden, when he actually finds Haaland in space and actually instinctively makes the pass, that's kind of how he's getting his assists. Whereas someone like Bernardo, who did get the assist on the day, I mean, that was a little bit of a fluke, right? Because it was a fantastic Cancelo goal to the top left. And that's my main issue with both these assets. I feel like they are slightly overpriced from that point of view. And I also just think that when we have to consider City assets, you have to consider what your team could be like with 3 City players. And ideally, what those 3 City players are. If one of them's Haaland, if one of them's Cancelo, I probably would still like that third player to be someone like an Ederson or a Stones at this point. Just someone who's able to get consistent amounts of points and maybe even outscore someone like a Bernardo who would on his day find a goal, on his day find an assist, but also have a high potential to blank because he's not necessarily playing a super offensive position. What I like about Bernardo, and the reason why I've decided to level Gundogan off, is I'm not really seeing Gundogan play and make as many attacking runs as I'd like. The Nottingham Forest game was a key example, and I do feel like Gundogan is someone who will be rotated more this season than Bernardo. So there's a huge downside as opposed to Gundogan, who we know can always find the net and has an eye for a goal, compared to someone like Bernardo, who's probably playing a little bit more minutes, but isn't always necessarily as involved when it comes to goals and assists as a player. And that's kind of why I feel like I've deliberately priced these assets in tier 2. As far as the 7.9 plus players, I've actually moved Foden provisionally to the top. What I like about Foden and Haaland so far is these are both players that I think have specifically been subbed off because Pep has the faith in them to play every single game. And by only getting 60 to 65 minutes of football, you are getting much less expected returns, and that clearly is going to bite into you because of the expected minutes. But I just feel like these are the players with the most amount of upside when I'm just watching City play week on week, and Foden for me is up there, even though he's not playing as many minutes as Diaz. The reason why I've risen Foden to the top is he just looks like the most interesting asset and someone who actually pairs up with Haaland, the absolute best in that team. So for me, he really deserves a rise towards the top of the sheet, especially since we know the City team will continue to build a lot of chances. And I think there's also a possibility here where we can see Foden play much more consistent minutes once this kind of heavy rotation period is over. As far as other assets like Saka, Maddison, Kulusevski, Saka looked interesting last week, but I still can't really rate him any higher. Unfortunately, he's still taking a lot of one-on-one opportunities, and I don't think he has the confidence to do the same things he did last season, such as rounding the keeper, finding and kind of clinically placing the ball into the net. As far as Maddison, the Leicester team still looks terrible. The games aren't so poor. Obviously, Tottenham in the future is going to be a tough game, but you know that Aston Villa game could be a great game for him. Kulusevski, similar situation where you have that City game pieced in the middle there, but of course he could be an explosive pick, especially versus Leicester. I feel like Fulham will be an absolutely tough game for this Tottenham team, who don't actually look as good or well oiled as we think they are. Mount and Bowen still unfortunately avoids. Bowen actually did seem to show a little bit of sign of rejuvenation. He was very, very close to scoring in the dying minutes of the Tottenham game, but I don't like how this West Ham team has taken so long to find its footing, and Bowen is just way too overpriced in my opinion to even consider. He does even also price block you, I guess, from going for some other assets in the game. That 0.5 really does make a difference, or even 0.4 if that's his price. Mount unfortunately got an assist, or rather not unfortunately, but I guess unfortunately for the owners who probably sold Mount after consecutive runs of blanks, but it didn't really make him any more interesting as an asset. I feel like, yes, he had a good game in comparison to the previous few weeks, and Tuchel clearly saw that as well by keeping Mount on the field, but the amount of inconsistency we've seen from him and how tough this West Ham game could be since they found a little bit of confidence versus Tottenham does worry me. And then with the Liverpool game closing in, I just feel like you've got better returns from someone like Diaz going forwards, or even a little bit of a punt in someone in the cheaper price rises. As far as the 10 plus options, I've moved Sterling up and De Bruyne down. The reason why I've not kept, let's say, Salah, Sterling, and De Bruyne all in the same tier, even though I actually think De Bruyne is a great captaincy shout versus Aston Villa since he got his rest for Nottingham Forest, is simply because I feel like this is a game where we have to always constantly think about how you can play around two premiums. And if you were the type of owner who, for some reason, doesn't have Haaland, and you were going Salah and De Bruyne, I feel like that just isn't optimal. De Bruyne's a little bit too expensive. Haaland's clearly the better asset to own, and I'm just trying to reflect that in the game. Whereas with Sterling, I feel like maybe you could find some price structures in your team to actually afford a Salah Sterling structure. Some people might even want to go for a 3-mum to actually adjust and play around Sterling, but we know that also does take you away from the defenders. But I do think Sterling is actually playing exceptionally well. The one thing is Chelsea as a whole has been very weak, and I've been speaking about that in the last 2 weeks in particular. Their inability to play around the midfield. Zakaria might be a huge upgrade, but I really need to see him on paper before I'm even able to adjust my thoughts on Chelsea and how the team's operating. But Sterling does look independently like a great asset, and with the Aubameyang deal, I'm not actually sure at the time of this recording whether he's actually been signed, but if he doesn't sign, it could actually suggest that Sterling could stay on penalties if that's the case. We have to see, because Tuchel has made comments in the past about how Jorginho might have to give away penalties so that some of his attackers can find form, but because Sterling has also been scoring so many goals, you can arguably say he's already found some form and probably doesn't deserve to take the penalties off Jorginho. It's an interesting thought, but I definitely think Sterling is well priced, and unfortunately he is at that kind of sticky territory where he does completely, or by going for Sterling, you are completely breaking the template team structure. You probably are not going for an 8.0 mid, and instead you're investing into maybe a cheaper defender or some cheaper midfielders such as the 5.5s. And whether you'd actually like to do that consistently is another question. So I feel like that's the issue with Sterling, but it is a risk that I think is worth taking. That's why I've risen him to the top. Moving on to the forwards, I feel like the first point to mention is probably people who are going to respond saying that Welbeck and Kane do not deserve to be the same level of asset as Mitrovic and Haaland. And to that, I would actually agree. I do think Mitrovic and Haaland are actually the two best well-priced assets in the game. I think Haaland is severely underpriced for what he's showing us so far, and the same thing with Mitrovic. They're both incredibly underpriced players, but it doesn't necessarily mean that players like Welbeck and Kane are overpriced or that they're poor in comparison. I feel like both Welbeck and Kane are interesting shouts that should be at the top tier, specifically a Welbeck who actually got rested after the Fulham game. I could maybe drop him, of course, if he continues to unimpress, but I feel like the Leicester game is such a great opportunity, and I do think he gets enough time and rest to play the Bournemouth game too, so we'll see what happens there with Welbeck. But as I said, Mitrovic and Haaland are the best options in the game. It doesn't necessarily mean that Kane and Welbeck do not belong as top options. I feel like that in terms of the forwards, it is a bit of a dire state because Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth strikers haven't been interesting. Even Southampton, you're seeing someone like Adam Armstrong score, and that takes away from someone like Adams, who we would expect to be usually the focal point of the team. And that's exactly why the cheat sheet is set out the way it is. Potentially next week I'll actually add an additional icon to signify how interesting Mitrovic and Haaland are. But I do think, for example, let's say if you're operating a true premium template, arguably Kane has been just as good as Salah so far. They both had 5 returns each. Haaland, unsurprisingly, has had 9 or 10. Mitrovic is someone who has absolutely conquered the game at his stats with incredibly tough fixtures. But Welbeck has been a decent shout too. Someone who actually looks interesting and plays for a team that have been creating good chances and have great games until game week 9. So that's why Welbeck is there. As far as Alvarez, he's actually risen in this cheat sheet, or rather been introduced as a new option. He looked incredible in the game versus Nottingham Forest. And yes, one of those factors is going to be the simple fact he did play versus Nottingham Forest. But I do think Alvarez has shown a lot of glimpses. He scored, for example, the Community Shield match versus Liverpool, coming on as a sub. The one concern is going to be his minutes. There are going to be games where he's playing 15 to 20 minutes a game, and we know that same thing happens to Mahrez. Mahrez has actually gotten a few starts this season, a little bit more than expected, but we do have a Sevilla game coming up very soon. That's a Champions League game, potentially Mahrez's alley, and we could see Alvarez once again play, even though he played 90 minutes in the previous match versus Nottingham Forest, and that's why I feel like he has so much upside, because at a 6.2 price, you could be gambling on someone who could easily get braces in any independent game because he just looks that good. If you revisit the Nottingham Forest highlights, it could have easily been a game where both Haaland and Julian Alvarez scored hat-tricks themselves. He hit the post in one of the early opportunities when he took an outside the post, outside the box shot. And that's how interesting he is for me. I think he's very direct. He can play both the central forward and right wing position, even play left wing sometimes interchangeably. And we know he's showcased a wide variety of goals in his time in Argentina with both feet and also even some headers. As far as 7.0 to 7.9 assets, I've risen Isaac, and he's a new asset as well. Isaac is someone who looked incredible for Liverpool. I think everyone watched the highlights, of course, how he kind of rinsed Robertson on the offside goal and offside chance. But overall, he looked incredibly precise. He was pressing for most of the game, and Eddie Howe simply explained that he was substituted off because he didn't get much training and had a little bit of a niggle mid-game and had a bit of a knock. So understandably, that's why he was subbed off, but I feel like going forwards with these fixtures on paper, especially with Crystal Palace's defense not looking particularly good, and then Bournemouth as well, you have great opportunities here to conquer with a 7.0 asset who will get a lot of minutes now that Wilson is injured. As far as Tony, for me, he's still interesting. Yes, he's blanked 2 weeks in a row, but these 2 next games are going to be key opportunities for me, I would say, to keep Tony as an owner. I can understand why people are moving immediately to Isaac. It just makes too much sense, right? You have someone who found a lot of form versus Liverpool, looked great, is a much more mobile striker, someone who definitely is a little bit easier on the eye than Tony and the way Brentford play, but I can understand keeping Tony in your team as well, because simply these are going to be a great opportunity for Tony to score. I would expect that game, for example, to be a both teams to score type game. And then Southampton, I would say, actually are a little bit of a tough game, but we know Brentford has the opportunity and also I would say the tools to actually do well versus the Southampton team, because they are very well matched with the physicality of Southampton, the way Brentford play. As far as Watkins, he's just an avoid. I mean, look at the fixtures and how they start to get worse and worse for Aston Villa. No real interest in them, and simply put, this Aston Villa team just hasn't looked exciting whatsoever when it comes to the attacking phases of the game. Yes, they scored a goal versus Arsenal, but you can also look at just the expected goals and their underlying stats, and you can see that the proof is in the pudding, that Aston Villa have really struggled to find any sort of formation to actually play consistent football with, and from the attacking point of view, it's very, very dire. 8.0 to 8.9, Firmino has actually risen. Firmino's just showed once again, and proving me wrong, to be honest, that he's consistently doing well in some of these slightly easier games, as I would describe them. Newcastle is a very tough opponent, and I thought Newcastle played exceptionally, so the fact that Firmino actually found a great chance to score and made some very, very key touches is something that I was really excited about, and that's why Firmino rises on the cheat sheet for me. He definitely played beyond my expectations in the game. I thought Salah was fantastic. Salah looked much more alive in the second half, and as did the Liverpool team. I do think there was a big dynamic with Liverpool chasing. We know in the last 2 years that they've been an incredible, or rather 3 or 4 years, that Liverpool have been an incredible team, especially even going down and specifically in the second half playing at Anfield. So I really liked Firmino's game. The fixtures on paper are very, very good, with the exception to Chelsea, who I would say have usually found it quite easy to nullify Liverpool, with exception to that game in Stamford Bridge last year. But for the most part, I would say Firmino's looked great, and because of Darwin, I guess, and his mishaps, and also Jota seemingly still not fit, it's a great opportunity to maybe go for a bit of a Firmino punt if you can really afford it. That's the real issue there. And potentially, if you're already moving into, or you already own Luis Diaz, I just find it so hard to move into Firmino at this point in time. And you probably would prefer some of the 8.0 mids as well over Firmino, because there's less of a kind of risk, I suppose, with Darwin Núñez coming back and even Jota potentially. So with Vardy and Darwin, they stay at the same positions. I just think this Leicester team are very, very poor Vardy is just overpriced, and then Darwin. It will take time for him to find his place back in the team, especially with Firmino back in form. And with Haaland and Kane, no changes. But Haaland clearly the best asset in the game, potentially by a country mile. Moving on to the defenders. I feel like there really aren't many changes in the defenders this week. I do think Sanchez is someone who I'm preemptively dropping because of the poor performance versus West Ham. And then also Romero probably closing in on a return. So that will probably take Sanchez out of the lineup, even though he's looked okay as a defender. I just can't really judge what Conte's going to do with the team. He's probably going to revert to what he started the season off with, because Conte is someone who usually does trust in his key players. And I think Romero is clearly one above Sanchez. So when it comes down to the cheat sheet, the layout is very similar. We have Arsenal defenders mostly and Brighton defenders who are the most interesting assets in the game. Nico Williams still at the top, and I think this is a great opportunity to actually play Nico Williams this week. If I was a manager who owned Nico Williams, I'd be highly considering him as a start. His expected goal involvements have been very high. If you were watching the first half of Nottingham Forest versus City, he could have even assisted Renan Lodi in the first half if Lodi found a better placed header and scored in the near post of Ederson. And that's how interesting Nico Williams is. You could argue that he's very wayward with passing, potentially a little bit raw as a player, and not as fine and fine-tuned, as someone like Trent or Reece James, and that's obviously going to be true. But the fact that he's neck and neck with those players in terms of expected goal involvements tells you all you need to know about a 4.0 mid. I mean, he's way beyond our expectations for what a 4.0 is, and I think anytime you get to play versus Bournemouth right now, especially with their conditions and then the manager situation, I think it's a great opportunity to maybe chance a little bit of upside here from Nico Williams this week. 5.0 to 5.4 options. Trippier has actually gone up to the top. I was really impressed with Newcastle's performance versus Liverpool, specifically with some of the rotated pieces and the injuries that they suffered from. And Trippier just seems like always such a goal threat from the set piece positions. That's always going to be a huge amount of upside each week. And now the fixtures are actually relatively good for this Newcastle team. West Ham do look a little bit back up to par, but Crystal Palace and Bournemouth, as I said, have been great teams that have been giving a lot of chances away to other opposing teams, and that's also a great opportunity for Trippier to do well. I mean, he's someone who can also deliver an open play. He's not just a set piece player. I think he's someone who can provide you bonus points as well with the amount of crosses he provides and also the set pieces that he takes. He also takes the longer free kicks, mind you. And yeah, I think with the corners too, you're basically looking at Trippier, who could be one of the best defenders on the cards, and especially an underpriced one as we head into the Game Week 9 wildcard. If we move on to Stones and Ake, these are options that have existed previously. Ake was someone who I put an asterisk over because I think as soon as he's fit, he could find some more minutes with the City team. I feel like Pep was really impressed with his early performances in the season, whereas Stones is someone who we saw actually start over Ruben Dias in the Newcastle game, and I think his early rest in the previous game versus Nottingham Forest does signal he's probably going to start once again versus Aston Villa, and it's a great opportunity to own Stones because we always know he's someone who provides a lot near post when it comes down to the corners, and that's exactly how he got his assist to Haaland this week as well. And he's always going to be someone who's nailed to bonus because he is relied on as someone in the Pep system to be the main ball progressor over Ruben Dias, and that's why I think Stones is such an interesting option this week. If you're moving on to the 5.5 plus assets, Perisic unfortunately has to drop alongside Robertson. These are for two different reasons. I think Perisic has actually played a lot more minutes than we expected. He's played more minutes than Trent, James, and even Robertson this week, and even Cancelo, I believe. So this is a time where I think he's going to be rested for the Fulham game, and potentially Conte will rely on him for Europe and even in the City game. Fulham is also going to be a tough game no matter what. I feel like, yes, whilst it's a green fixture on paper for Tottenham, Fulham have really electrified the league, and so far them scoring versus Liverpool and Arsenal are no joke. I thought they also completely bossed Brighton as well. The scoreline was probably a little bit closer than it reflected because it was simply a little bit of a fluke penalty from Brighton. It wasn't like Fulham were in any danger. It was a bit of a mistake, and Reed wasn't able to actually assess where Stupinian was when he was actually trying to clear the ball. And when you actually look at Fulham, yes, they're actually a little bit of a leaky defense, which is a great opportunity for Perisic to play, but I think the expected minutes just aren't there for him. I think like this is the perfect game to rotate him, arguably for Conte, especially since he played a 90 minutes versus West Ham. So that's the kind of situation that Perisic finds himself in. With Dias, he still remains exactly where he is. I do think he's just a little bit overpriced as a City asset. You much rather go into someone like Ederson at this point, or even chance it with someone like Stones. As far as Robertson, he's dropped because, as I said, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think I made a Game Week 4 preview video about the expected goal involvements of Robertson and Trent. I was comparing similar stats like how many crosses they were doing, how many effective goal involvements were they creating, and even chances created. And Trent basically far supersedes Robertson, not to mention that Tsimikas has been a very frequent sub for Robertson lately. Yes, Trent was also subbed off early versus Newcastle, but I think from a game to game, especially with the lack of suitable replacements at right back for Trent, Trent is the far superior option for a Liverpool team who have been really struggling to keep clean sheets. If Liverpool looked a little bit more organised in defence, if they actually had someone in place of Joe Gomez, because I don't really like this Van Dijk-Joe Gomez partnership, then maybe I would consider Robertson as a better option, but I really have to drop him into the third tier, and unfortunately that's just the situation, even though the fixtures are so great for Liverpool on paper. And that's pretty much the same situation that Van Dijk finds himself in, because you're just chancing for a set piece chance and for a team that doesn't really look like they're going to get clean sheets. Rounding out the Game Week 6 cheat sheet with the goalkeepers, we actually have a situation where a lot of the 4.5 to 4.9 keepers are quite interesting, especially in a situation where Ramsdale doesn't look particularly good as an asset, and I feel like a lot of managers are going to be thinking about replacements to Mendy as well. In this situation, we have Sanchez, who's great fixtures, and I think he's the clear asset on paper to go for. But he does probably close you from opportunities to move into some cheaper players, because he is now priced at 4.7. One of the issues with Sanchez as well is I imagine a lot of people do have a Brighton centre-back or someone like Estupinian that were brought in last week, potentially as a replacement to someone like Reece James in the previous week. If that's their situation, I wouldn't really back a double Brighton defense. And I would also say that Raya is someone who is a little bit more interesting if we're talking about beyond the Game Week 9 wildcard. If you're choosing to do a little bit of a later of a wildcard and you feel like your team is set up in a good space, I do think Raya is an interesting player to go for. Whereas Henderson is someone who I think fits the bill of a Game Week 9 wildcard a little bit better, simply because you've got Bournemouth, Leeds, and Fulham as the 3 games heading into Game Week 9. So for me, I do think Henderson is a little bit better than Raya there. But when it comes down to the expected stats, it's clearly a stark difference between how good Brentford is as a defense compared to Nottingham Forest. And that's kind of why we have like 3 interesting players here at the top tier. Mesley and Pickford still don't interest me. Leeds and Everton are probably one of the worst defenses in the league. And it doesn't really matter how good quality the shot stopping is from Mesley and Pickford. I do think, for example, with Leeds, the Chelsea game was a bit of an aberration. And with Everton, they are close to being one of the top teams in the league for expected goals conceded, and that's reflected by how Pickford is a third tier asset. As far as the 5.0 plus options, I've kept Pope as a top asset whilst dropping Ramsdale. I spoke about how Ramsdale had a great opportunity to get an Aston Villa clean sheet last week, and it was really depressing, I would say, to see Ramsdale actually lose that clean sheet once again to another very low scoring chance. And arguably a lot of people would have been understandably perplexed at the decision, or would even find a point of view to say that Aston Villa really didn't deserve their goal. But whatever the situation is, the result is the same. Ramsdale loses another clean sheet, and he's not making enough saves as a keeper to justify his price. Ultimately, I probably prefer someone like Pope, who does concede a few more saves per game, low expected goal conceded shots, whereas this Arsenal team are actually stopping a lot of teams from even creating any shots scoring or shot taking opportunities versus them. And that's actually why Ramsdale for me drops as an asset. Salah was someone who I expected to get a clean sheet last week, and he did versus Bournemouth. Yes, of course, Liverpool and City are going to be extremely tough games, so maybe not the most interesting asset, but just something to think about, because this Wolves team is reverting to being very, very defensive, and they will be conceding a lot more shots than someone like Ramsdale. So I think on equivalence, even though Arsenal are such a good defense on paper, it's not really been borne out by the 5.0 punt that would have been Ramsdale as a goalkeeper. As far as the 5.5 options, no changes there, and that's going to be the cheat sheet done for this week. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.